In the canyons of Lower Manhattan, there is a specific type of silence that precedes a storm, not the silence of a void, but the pressurized quiet of a machine holding its breath. We are taught to believe that money is a physical thing, a heavy anchor of gold or a crisp stack of linen, but the modern financial system is actually a ghost story told in digital ink. In the autumn of a single fiscal year, $34 billion evaporated from the accounts of New York's most prestigious institutions, moving through the wires like a fever through a nervous system, leaving behind nothing but scorched ledgers and a haunting question of jurisdiction. This was not a heist involving masks and vaults, it was a systemic migration, a mathematical exodus where the exits were paved with legal fine print and the fingerprints were wiped clean by the very laws designed to catch them. The scale of this disappearance represents more than just a loss of capital, it is a fracture in the foundational myth of the American century. When such a sum leaves the world's financial heart without a single siren wailing or a single pair of handcuffs clicking shut, we must realize that the rules of gravity have changed for those who inhabit the upper atmosphere of the balance sheet. To follow this money is to descend into the invisible scaffolding of global power, where the line between a crime and a clever accounting maneuver is thinner than a fiber optic cable. If you seek to understand the mechanics of power and the shadows where the world's true ledger is kept, subscribe. And tell us, which corner of the global map are you watching from? The architecture of New York's financial dominance was never built on stone alone, it was built on the sanctity of the record. For over a century, the global elite parked their wealth in Manhattan because they believed the ledger was a sacred text, guarded by the high priests of the Federal Reserve and the SEC. But the seeds of the $34 billion exodus were planted not in a moment of crisis, but in a moment of quiet deregulation, hidden within the 1,000-page annexes of a routine banking bill. This was the paper cathedral, a structure so complex that its own architects began to forget which walls were load-bearing and which were merely decorative. The paradoxical discovery began when a mid-level analyst noticed a ripple in the overnight lending markets, a subtle dip in the grease that keeps the gears of the city turning. It was as if a massive physical object had been removed from a room, but the furniture hadn't been moved to compensate for the space. $34 billion is a weight that should leave a crater, instead, it left a vacuum. The systemic irony was clear, the very transparency meant to protect the market was now being used as a map for the exit. Investors began to realize that the safe harbor of New York was actually a sieve, and the first drips of capital were starting to pool in the dark corners of offshore jurisdictions that didn't exist on any traditional map. The battlefield had shifted. It was no longer fought over land or oil, but over the custody of the digital pulse. As the analysts dug deeper, they discovered that the seed of the migration, a series of sophisticated mirror trades that allowed capital to exist in two places at once before collapsing into a final, untraceable destination. In the cold blue light of the trading floor, the numbers began to lie. The high priests, the central bankers, watched their monitors with a growing, silent dread. They realized that the $34 billion wasn't being stolen, it was being demanifested. It was a systemic strike, an extraction of the city's lifeblood performed with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of an algorithm. Ordinary citizens went about their day, buying coffee and paying rent, unaware that the floor beneath their feet was thinning. The paradox was biting, the more the public trusted the strength of the dollar, the faster the architects were moving it into stateless assets. This was the moment the balance sheet became a weapon of war. The discovery was not of a leak, but of a deliberate trapdoor built into the very foundation of the paper cathedral. By the time the regulators reached for the lever to stop the flow, they found the handle had been disconnected years ago. The money wasn't just gone, it had never truly been there to begin with. As the $34 billion began its final acceleration out of New York, the movement took on the properties of a circular mirror. To the outside observer, the liquidity appeared to be staying within the system, but this was a trick of the light, a financial kinetic mirage. The capital was being recycled through a series of shadow banks and synthetic entities, each one reflecting the value back to the previous one, creating the illusion of a solid floor while the basement was being hollowed out. It is the fundamental law of the modern shark, the system must keep moving to breathe. If the flow of this ghost money ever stopped, the reflection would shatter, revealing the empty space where the city's wealth used to sit. The escalation was silent. On the trading floors, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to a predatory instinct. The anonymous high priests at the central banks began to see the anomalies as a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a temporary bug. They realized the rules had changed because the players had outpaced the referee. In the boardrooms of the ultra-wealthy, the sentiment was one of cold pragmatism. They weren't fleeing a crisis, they were relocating to a reality where the necessary illusion of sovereign regulation no longer applied to them. The dust on the old ledgers in the basement of the New York Fed remained undisturbed, while the digital reality they represented was being rewritten in real time. The momentum of the exodus reached a terminal velocity where the system's survival depended on its own denial. To acknowledge the missing billions would be to admit that the safety of the Western financial heart was a hollow promise. Consequently, the markets reacted with a strange, frantic optimism, a feverish buy-in that masked the quiet exit of the smart money. This is the systemic irony of the kinetic mirage: the faster the blood leaves the body, the more the heart pumps to compensate. Governments scrambled to issue statements of stability, but their words felt like thin paper against a rising tide. The high priests knew the truth: the anchor had been cut, and the ship was drifting into uncharted waters. In the streets, the sensory reality was jarring. While the blue light of the trading floors flickered with the frantic movement of fleeing capital, the ordinary citizen felt only a dull, inexplicable anxiety. They saw the luxury towers still standing, the lights still burning in the penthouses, but the DNA of the city had changed. The rules were no longer about accumulation, but about escape velocity. The world had realized that the $34 billion wasn't just money, it was the trust that held the social contract together. As the last of the digital transfers cleared, the realization set in: the exit wasn't a malfunction of the machine was designed to provide an exit for those who knew where to find the door. The final destination of the $34 billion was never a physical place, but a new class of digital sovereignty. This was the Great Transfer, a moment where power shifted from the institutions of the state to the keepers of the private ledger. As the money settled into its new, untraceable home, the human truth began to crystallize. The loss was not felt in the bank accounts of the elite, but in the eroding public infrastructure and the quiet inflation that ate at the savings of the middle class. The ghost in the ledger was the phantom of a debt that the public was now expected to service, for a wealth they would never see. The high priests remained silent, knowing that to explain the disappearance was to invite the fire. The existential realization was simple and terrifying: the system didn't break, it functioned perfectly. The $34 billion left New York because the city had served its purpose as an incubator, and now, the capital had outgrown its shell. The transfer of power was complete. The ordinary citizen, looking at the skyline, saw only the familiar silhouette of a financial titan. But inside, the DNA had been replaced. The ledger was no longer a public record of trust, it was a private map of escape. The final realization is the most bitter pill to swallow: the exit was legal. In the end, no one went to jail because the theft was committed through the medium of the law itself. The $34 billion didn't vanish into a vacuum, it was absorbed into a global, dark pool, where money loses its nationality and its morality. As the sun sets over the Hudson, casting long, orange shadows across the glass facades of the financial district, the city remains a monument to a power that has already moved on. The invisible scaffolding of the world has been rebuilt, and we are left living in the shadow of a cathedral whose gods have departed. The weight of this exodus is now carried by those who can least afford the burden, the taxpayers who unknowingly underwrite the stability of a system that allows its most vital assets to slip away in the night. This is the ultimate systemic logic: the many provide the foundation, while the few utilize the ceiling. We are left with a ledger that balances only on the surface, while beneath the digital skin, the pulse of global wealth beats in a rhythm we are no longer permitted to hear. The silence in New York isn't the absence of noise, it's the sound of a promise being retracted, leaving us to wonder if the money was ever ours to begin with, or if we were merely the hosts for a guest that had no intention of staying. In the end, we are left to realize that your bank account is not just a storage of value, it is a sensor on a global network. When $34 billion leaves a city without a sound, it changes the atmospheric pressure of your own life, the price of your rent, the stability of your pension, and the weight of the taxes you pay to maintain the streets the money left behind. We live in a world where the ledger is no longer a public record, but a private fortress. The heart of global finance still beats, but it beats for a system that has learned how to transcend the very borders it once built. If the architecture is invisible, then the only way to remain free is to learn how to see the scaffolding.